Could you explain why a critic of cultural relativism might rebut the argument for cultural relativism? What is so-called moral realism? Why might someone argue for moral realism? And why might someone claim that might really doesn't make right? Because might is about what is the case, physical power, or intellectual in some cases. Whereas when we speak of rightness, folks, we are speaking about what should be the case. And I guess this will be my last word on this. You'll notice, how many of you saw the author's example? Some of you appealed to it in your homework. I said I wouldn't answer my question, but I'm going to. How many of you saw the author's discussion about... The author gave the example of the civil rights movement of a case that might be thought of in terms of the might makes right question. How did the author's discussion ensue? Yeah, that's the word I wanted. How did the conversation ensue here? Any takers? Or nah? Many of us believe that a society with Jim Crow laws is an unjust society. That a better society is one where there is institutional fairness. And the civil rights movement, many people would say, was using that the civil rights movement was about using might for right. And what do I mean when I say the civil rights movement did end up having might once people figured some things out? And by the way, civil rights movement couldn't have happened if it were not for certain power structures. Shepard.
Well, for your question, can you repeat the question?
There were several of them there.
The one regarding might and the civil rights movement.
Yeah, the civil rights movement did discover that it had a certain kind of might. Once it got what? I'll use a cliche here. At some point, they got critical mass. Yeah.
Popular support?
Yeah. They ended up getting enough popular support. Now, the might makes right crowd might point out that what ended up happening was enough high-minded white liberals also got behind the civil rights movement, and they forced the government's hand. By the way, at first, JFK and the like were not for the civil rights movement. As a matter of fact, they did what they could to undermine Dr. King. You know about this now, right? It's one of those things that's not likely to make it into your high school history books, though, because it would make the FBI look bad, or at least what the FBI was asked to do. Illegal wiretapping in the name of national security, yeah.
Though, to be fair, Hoover was in a little bit of a bind because if he didn't do it, then Nixon would have found someone else to do it.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, they also considered him to be, pardon my bad language, a damn commie. Some people referred to Dr. King as a damn commie, and we wouldn't want that damn commie to undermine the system. Well, eventually, critical mass did happen. And a whole bunch of people with institutional power got behind the civil rights movement too. Now, it is the fact that they did in fact end up having might. Because you know how it goes? In order to fight power, you sometimes need counter power. Now, many people will say it was a newfound might used in the service of right. But guess what you have to have in order to make that claim? You have to have a meaningful theory of right. And remember, if you're a relativist, what are you going to say about right and wrong? Yeah, there's really no such thing. It's all a matter of perspective. If you happen to come from a society where you believe that monarchy is the right way of doing things, and that stratified social classes based on race are the right way of doing things, then for you, that is the right way of doing things. To talk about rightness in and of itself is to suggest that there are certain absolute values that are not merely a matter of opinion. And in order to do so, you would need to produce some kind of meaningful argument for how we could determine such absolute rights. I should say, what's right and what's wrong, not rights in the political sense. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is our segue. Take a guess what thinkers are going to be opposed to the kind of thinking that we see in the sophists. Socrates and Plato will be opposed to the viewpoints and the conclusions drawn by the sophists. And I admit over the course of the next week, I will probably sometimes say Plato when I mean to say Socrates. And for those of you who read the chapter, you might know why. This archetypal philosopher named Socrates left no what? He left no writings behind. What we think we know about him is found largely through the what? Yeah.
And then there's one more.
Plato and Xenophon. Yeah, most of what we think we know about Socrates, the historical Socrates, comes through the writings of Plato, as well as Socrates' younger contemporary Xenophon. So in other words, we don't have a lot of hard data on Socrates. And by the way, that very famous, you saw the bust of Socrates in the book? You saw that picture of him? We can't even be certain if what?
If that even is him.
Yeah, we can't even be certain if that's what he looked like. We don't have color photographs of him or anything. However, that image of him is fairly consistent with the way Socrates describes himself in one of Plato's dialogues. Now, the author of our text describes Socrates as what many have referred to as an archetypal philosopher. Why is he described as an archetypal philosopher? Yes?
He's like the ideal philosopher.
Yeah. He lived about as an ideal philosopher as well as a human being could be. And to give you another phrase that's along these lines, the author also uses this phrase, Socrates as a paradigmatic individual. And a paradigm case means an excellent example. He is the excellent case of what a human being can be like if she sets her mind to being the best human being she can possibly be. Now, part of the beauty of Socrates is although in his dialogues he sometimes seems to be pretty darn sarcastic, I'll admit that. Many students, when they read particularly Plato's Apology, they think, this guy doesn't sound humble, pardon my language, he sounds like a smartass. Well, sometimes you need to slap people alongside the head to get their attention. And by the way, sometimes the kind of arrogant people he was dealing with needed to be insulted in subtle ways in order to get their attention. But yeah, Socrates is almost always portrayed as a humble human being who knew what he was capable of, but he was also aware of his limitations. And by the way, when I talk about about his limitations, I am talking about our human limitations in general. And we actually alluded to this when we did the introductory material. Once you realize that you are finite, just like the rest of the human community, once you realize that you are finite, a very small individual born at a specific time in a very long, not just human history, but geologic history, and that you will be gone pretty much just as what?
As soon as you got here.
Yeah, just as quickly as you came into this world. It is a little bit more difficult to be puffed up. You know, arrogant. To recognize in the grand scheme of things, simply because you are human, you are already by your very nature limited. You will never be able to have total knowledge nor total wisdom. Because knowledge and wisdom are not what?
The same.
Yeah, they are not the same thing. It is possible to have a vast amount of knowledge, but to lack any kind of practical wisdom about what it means to live a good and decent life. And that was part of the difference that the author suggests between Socrates and some of his opponents. He had practical wisdom about how to live a good life. And part of that is recognizing one's humility. And by the way, I'll also add this. Part of his being an archetypal individual and philosopher was that he practiced what? To use that popular phrase, he practiced
Self-control.
Yeah, he practiced what he preached. In other words, he not only talked a good game about the virtuous life, he did a pretty darn good job of living a virtuous life. And Mr. Peters fortunately made an important comment that I'm going to come to later. One of the things about, you might remember that when we were talking about the sophists last time, and I'm just going to refresh your memory. We said that sophists, such as that fellow Thrasymachus that was mentioned in chapter 3, Thrasymachus said that if you want to be a happy person, what do you really need to acquire ultimately? He doesn't quite come out and say this, but it's implicit. The more power that you have, the happier you will ultimately be. Because if you have enough power, you can do whatever you want, get whatever you want. Now, ultimately, the likes of Thrasymachus tended to see human happiness They tended to see happiness in terms of material things, or what I like to call visceral things. You know, feeling good. Now, in contrast, Socrates believed that the good person, can you still see this, I hope? Socrates was concerned about what part of his being. Socrates contends that all of us would be better off if we were good physicians for the soul. And by the way, one of the claims that the author makes, and we find it in the work of Plato, if we're to trust Plato, Socrates made the claim, I am a physician, but I am not the kind of physician that attends to just the physical well-being of people. I act as what we call a physician of the soul. I help people to set their true being, their inner self, in the right direction. And by the way, according to him, and this is where Mr. Peter's comment from a few minutes comes in, if you want to take good care of your soul, according to him, you are best off if you find out what the virtuous life is, and then you do the best you can to make your life align with that. Mr. Shepard.
So, but wouldn't the virtuous life be subjective to different people?
Socrates will argue no, and I will do my best to give you a version of his account of the virtuous life. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these are two of the famous inscriptions at the Delphic Oracle that are basically the kind of positions that someone like Socrates took when describing, or at least explaining, some facets of the virtuous life. One of them I know you've heard before. The plain English translation from the Greek is know thyself. If you want to really know yourself, I would actually find out that I am not just this flesh and bone person with a particular name living at a particular time. I subscribe to this form that we call the human form. As a human being, there are certain things that are conducive to my living a good life, whether I know them or not and whether I believe them or not. But once I come to find out my true nature, and I grapple with that, at that point I will have better knowledge of who and what I am. And I will be the better for it. Too many people walk through life as if they were sleepwalkers, sort of kind of going through the motions, doing what is expected of them, and also adopting what kind of versions of happiness. Yeah, in other words, they will merely imprint the models of happiness. In America, it's materialism, and I don't want to be too cynical here, but I like to call it the fake virtue that some people get through not good religion, but bad religion. In other words, the idea, if I do all this stuff, not only will God give me earthly rewards, which are material stuff, but my real aim is on the big prize. And the big prize is almost always in terms of God giving them some version of heavenly riches. In other words, it's a little bit like it's streets paved with gold, that kind of stuff. Now, of course, the person who understands these things would say those people miss the mark. And I guess I'm going to digress back to something. But for those of you who read the text, the author mentions a German writer by the name of Karl Jaspers. Jaspers wrote a wonderful little book that the author mentions. It's called Socrates, Confucius, Buddha, Jesus. Now, in this book, Jaspers never claimed that these four men had exactly the same ideas. He never makes that claim. But what he does claim is that all four of these individuals were archetypal individuals. Physicians of the soul who had similar lessons to teach people, but not necessarily the identical ones. And all four of these men lived what kind of lives? Although they all came to different ends. They all lived virtuous lives. And the reason I brought this up was not only because it's in the book, but because I wanted to, reference a story about Jesus. Many of you people who are accustomed to the Bible or know your Bibles might know that there was a conversation, there's allegedly a conversation between Jesus and a few of his disciples who are asking Jesus, when we get to your heaven, Jesus, where will I be seated? How many of you remember hearing this story? So basically these guys were looking for a power pecking order. I imagine Jesus was pretty darn exasperated when he got that question. Because obviously these guys had been listening to him for the better part of a year. And what?
It seemed like they didn't
get it. They really didn't get it. We're not talking about a place with literal kings and a court. We're talking about your spiritual house and getting your spiritual house in order. And that's not just something for the hereafter. That's technically what? That's something also for the here and now. Sorry, I'm getting all excited about this. But yeah, if all of these figures, according to Jaspers, were virtuous people who got the big picture. The big picture is in part that a life where you merely seek a whole bunch of material possessions, physical contentedness, and ultimately dying with the most toys is not going to give you either a good life or will it really give you a happy life. And if I can give you an example, not a specific one, but a general one, you probably have either witnessed personally or in the wider culture very wealthy people who are unhappy and rotten to the core. I'm not going to name any names. But very wealthy people with lots of power and all the toys they can imagine that are rotten to the core, who have built monuments to their own glory, but are obviously not happy. Someone like Socrates would say it's because they are missing something. They are missing something. Their souls are imbalanced. It's because they are seeking the wrong things. They are seeking the wrong things to make them happy. And you'll never be happy if your soul's not directed in the right way. Now the other inscription, you might hear it rendered as all things in moderation. It's essentially the same thing. Nothing in excess. This is the idea that a life of the best life for a human being is to live a life of moderation. And a life of moderation, don't make this mistake. A life of moderation is not a life of self-denial. It is sort of like a middle road. There is nothing wrong with physical pleasure. But Liberace was wrong. Too much of a good thing is not wonderful. I won't do my Liberace. You know Liberace, right? Too much of a good thing is wonderful was his famous expression. No, I would say too much of a good thing will make that good thing boring and dull, so much that you don't want it anymore. How many of you know that about things? Material things get dull after time. The things that you once thought were the cheapest of pleasures get boring after a while. The sort of moderate life where you do nothing in excess is wiser. And by the way, the not so funny joke is, most people think it's a fun thing to party and get dog drunk. And I'm not saying it's not sometimes fun. But most of us learn what? Very quickly. Might lead you, yeah, it's not worth it in the long run. If it's not the hangover the next day, it's the fact that you didn't get your homework done, do your reading or whatever. And plus the stupidity that you might have done during the whole, raucous debacle or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, the life of moderation is, in the long run, a better life. Now, a couple little things. Now, Socrates is the main speaker in almost all of Plato's dialogue. Well, the first 2/3 of Plato's dialogues. And in the course of these dialogues, we get a sense of the quintessential teaching style of Socrates. He used something that's popularly called what? It's where we get this idea of using the Socratic method as a pathway towards getting to the quote-unquote truth. The Socratic method also is known by what other name? Starts with a D.
Dialects.
Dialectic. It's also called the Socratic dialectic or the dialectical method. Now the idea with dialectic is when you approach a complex problem, if you want to get the best answer, or at least closest to the best answer, what you need to do is go all the way around it. In other words, look at it from what?
Many different angles.
Yeah, as many different angles as possible. Now you'll notice that in this process, it will take a long time. You may never get to the answer, but you certainly will get better ideas about which answers are better than some of the other possibilities. That's the idea of this method. Now, to sort of formalize it, and when I say formalize it, I'm going to talk about it in terms of a step-by-step process. You might hear it rendered in some similar way, but not identical way.